Hello and welcome to this lecture on role morality, deriving ethical standards from social roles. The material we'll be covering in this lecture draws primarily from the articles that were provided in Learning Module 2, so be sure that you read those carefully, and then this video will help go over some of the material found in them. Role morality and ethics. Alright, now you might be wondering, what the heck is role morality and what does it have to do with ethics? Well, remember from Learning Module 1 we talked about practical ethics, and role morality is the approach to morality that most closely partners or matches with practical ethics. And here the idea is that the ethical requirements of a practice or a role arise generally from the morally relevant features of the practice or the role itself. That is to say that obligations, duties, and requirements, and any authority or discretion or autonomy that one has can either apply universally to everyone or can apply more specifically to people who occupy a particular role or engage in a particular practice. Role morality is the approach that identifies obligations, duties, requirements, and elements of authority that apply within a particular role or within a particular practice to the people who participate in that practice or who are members or participants within that role. And these requirements and obligations would then apply universally to those participants in that practice or in that role. These obligations, duties, etc. also derive from the defining purpose of the role. And if you're not clear what the purpose is and why this is important, please review the lecture on practical ethics. This purpose then serves as an objective basis for the obligations, duties, and requirements of participants of that role or within that practice. That is, the purpose serves as a basis separate and distinct from the individual participants and their own feelings or beliefs or values. The purpose of the role or the purpose of the practice serves as an external or objective basis for generating or defining obligations, duties, and requirements. Any differential standards of conducts between role holders and non-role holders similarly derive from objectively justified social expectations on the role holders. And these are, of course, also articulated in terms of the role or the practice's purpose. These obligations, however, though they're objective, pertaining to the practice or the role, are conditional. That is to say, they only apply insofar as an individual is occupying that role. And when they're occupying that role or they're engaged in that practice or that profession, then that individual is obligated to do what's required to the extent that that role or that practice or that profession specifies. When that individual isn't engaged in that role, then these obligations, duties, and requirements would not be binding on them. And obligations that are owed only to role-identified others. So for example, let's take, for example, the social role of parent, and we haven't yet talked about social roles, but that's a few slides ahead, but just bear with me. So if we think about a parent as a role one plays in society, then insofar as one is a parent, one has the obligations of a parent, and among those obligations might include taking care of one's children, making sure they're fed, housed, clothed, educated, and so forth, raising them up to be a functioning member of society, teaching them a language so that they can operate in the society, and culturating them into the traditions and practices and values of the society, and so forth. All of those can be understood as obligations one has as a parent. However, when one is not a parent, or no longer a parent, or when one is a parent but in the presence of other children not one's own, then the boundaries of those obligations one has as a parent are constrained and fit only within the particular role when carried out, and are owed only to the specific designees of that role or of that function, and that would be to one's own children, not to children broadly. So in that sense, the obligations, duties, requirements, and elements of authority that attach to roles are conditional obligations. They're conditional upon the particular role, its boundaries, when one is occupying it, and are owed to those others who are specified as the ones toward whom one has duties within that role. Okay, role morality. What is it? Let's get a little more clear here. Role morality refers to the moral obligations or requirements which are associated with a social role. And again, we'll take a look at what a social role is in a second. And so that is to say that role morality allows us to identify special obligations which are distinct from the obligations we would have under ordinary morality or everyday morality or morality that applies to everyone. And we've seen some of these special obligations in earlier lectures. For example, fiduciary duty. That's a special kind of duty one has, in particular toward one's clients. If you're not the kind of person who has clients, then fiduciary duty is not a kind of duty that you should expect to have, nor should we, as members of society, expect you to fulfill any fiduciary duties in the absence of clients, in the absence of occupying a role within which you would have clients. There's no sense, no meaning to a fiduciary duty. Conflicts of interest, that's another area we've talked about briefly and we'll talk about more later on, but the duty to avoid conflicts of interest. One has conflicts of interest when one occupies more than one role or more than one function or more than one position, and so one's interest from position A conflicts with one's interest from position B, and so one has a duty to avoid those kinds of conflicts. And that's the kind of duty that would only be pertinent to someone who occupies multiple roles or multiple professional positions or occupations. A duty of impartiality, similarly, is a duty that can be understood as a special obligation that we have. A teacher has an obligation to be impartial with regard to her students so that the A's don't all get distributed to her favorite students while the D's and the F's get distributed to the students she likes the least. The teacher's obligation as a teacher requires her to be impartial, and that is a duty that pertains to the purpose and function of the occupation of a teacher. That is, one is supposed to educate and provide opportunity for others to learn, and that is impeded if one conducts that, if one tries to achieve that purpose by being partial and discriminatory in those ways. So, role morality also then can be said to be due to morally relevant power or authority that the role holder, the occupant, the professional, has. The reason why teachers have a duty of impartiality is because they have a certain power relative to their students. They have the power to distribute grades, they have the power to distribute opportunities to learn, they have the power to assess the student's achievement. And so in those ways, that duty of impartiality tempers the exercise of that power. And it's a duty because of the existence of that power and of the possibility for that power to be abused. Now, the flip side of that, of course, is that these duties are also due to morally relevant vulnerability of others to the actions of the role holder. The student is vulnerable to the teacher's use and exercise of her power. Children are vulnerable to the decisions that parents make. And if a parent makes bad decisions or decisions on the basis of interests of his own instead of the interests of his child, then the child becomes vulnerable to whatever harms or risks or deprivations result. And additionally, role morality identifies moral obligations as due in large part to the trust that society has placed in those who occupy those roles or those professions or engage in those practices. parenting is a crucial social role. It's imperative that it be done right and done well, and so society trusts that those who undertake that role will do so well. Now, of course, that applies also to professions like lawyers, doctors, accountants, and firefighters, and so forth. And finally, the obligations or requirements of a particular role are in large part due to the official or professional status. Role morality, by and large, is a kind of morality. It's an approach to morality that we use to talk about mostly institutionalized and professionalized roles, not so much to the more generic role of brother, sister, parent, friend, and so forth, but more to the kinds of roles that have become professionalized, like police, teachers, accountants, lawyers, doctors, nurses, engineers, and so forth. Now, some philosophers, some ethicists argue, look, yeah, we do have special obligations that attach to specific roles and professions, but it may be the case that these obligations are really just variations on obligations and requirements and duties that we have ordinarily and that we ordinarily owe to everyone. And so ethicists who take this view that role morality really is picking out duties and obligations that are generally applicable, just sort of maybe amplified, or our expectations are raised with regard to professions and role occupants, that what they're doing is really just picking out everyday values that we ought to use in conducting our affairs with everybody, such as the values of trust, integrity, responsiveness, respect, and fairness. And largely what we'll find through the rest of this semester, especially as we delve into the specific values and principles that we'll be examining in more detail, you'll probably see that the approach we're going to take is that the values that are appropriate to professions and public service, broadly speaking, are really variations on obligations and principles we should use in our everyday lives, and that should apply universally. So, for example, fairness and integrity, and looking out for the best interest or minimizing harm, these are all duties that we have and should expect each other to comply with every day, regardless of the role that we're in, or if we're in no role in particular, but just principles and values that we should comply with as good people, as opposed to a good lawyer or a good doctor. All right, a little bit about social roles. Well, I'm sure it's pretty clear now since I've given you some examples of what social roles are, but a social role generally is a nameable, institutionally defined, or socially recognized position. Now, it's important to recognize this significant distinction. It's not necessarily the case that a social role is voluntarily assumed. It may be voluntarily assumed, but it may not be voluntarily assumed. It may be assumed without one's consent or without one opting to undertake it. For example, grandmother is generally not a voluntarily assumed social role. It's a recognizable, socially defined role, but it's not usually something that's voluntarily assumed. One sort of becomes a grandmother when one's own children have children of their own. Now, one can do it well by then jumping in and adopting this role and seeking to do it well, or one could opt to not and think, well, yeah, I'm a grandmother, but that was kind of by accident. Compare that with for example, with a rabbi or an engineer or a pharmacist. You have to undergo training and specialized education and certification. You have to apply to and be selected to participate in the training and the certification opportunities to become a rabbi or to become an engineer or to become a pharmacist. It's not the case that you accidentally become an engineer. You don't wake up one morning and realize that someone else, a friend of yours, made a decision that suddenly makes you a pharmacist. That's not quite the way it works. These are voluntarily assumed as opposed to non-voluntarily assumed social roles. It's also important to note that we may hold more than one social role simultaneously. And so when we do, we are then subject simultaneously to competing role-determined obligations. One might be, you might be a parent, as I know several of you in this class are, and also a student because you're in this class. Right? It might be the case that you know some people in the class and they are friends, and so you have the social role of friend and student and parent. It may be the case that some of you, and I know this is the case for several of you, are firefighters, professionally trained firefighters. That's a social role, a socially recognized role, institutionally defined, but you're also a student in this class. And you may also be a parent. As well, or you may, for some of you more senior, may also already be grandparents as well as parents and firefighters and students in this class. And so in that sense you can see how we each occupy a variety of roles simultaneously. And so when we do, we then have the obligations of each of those roles simultaneously. It's also important to note that the content and the function of social roles are negotiated with society and that they're in flux and change. Now, it's not the case that we have a sort of negotiation publicly, but as society grows and transforms and changes and expands or contracts or develops in one way or another way, has a certain historical context and with transformative dynamics within that society, then we should also expect to see that the roles that society recognizes and chooses to institutionally define will change and be in flux as well. And so what it meant to be a parent 1,000 years ago may be different from what it means to be a parent today. And so what it means to be a parent in one particular society might be different from the scope of what it means to be a parent in another particular society. Though the core of the role will be similar, and that's how it is that we can identify parent, parent, parent in society A, society B, society C, or society today versus society 100 years ago versus society 100 years in the future. There's a core purpose and function that occupants of that role play that is identifiable and that designates it as the role of parent as opposed to the role of teacher, even though a lot of what parents do is teach, but we can distinguish those roles one from another by the core of their function. All right, so what values are promoted or are served by society allowing this kind of specialization? Well, as societies become more complex, we get specialization of functions and division of socially necessary labor. A very long time ago, it may have been the case that parents were the only ones who taught children anything, and so there was no socially distinguished role of teacher. It was parents who performed all of the functions that we today recognize as the functions of teacher. And so somewhere along the way, we would want to see an account of how society transformed such that those two roles became distinct and allowed us to designate those. It may have been some time ago that policing was a function performed by volunteers in a society, and as society becomes more complex and bigger and larger and we don't know everybody anymore, then it becomes necessary. It's useful for all of us. We're all better off if we have people who are tasked with that specific function, that specific purpose, and that they get trained and learn how to do it well, as opposed to us sort of volunteering and doing it haphazardly. And you can see this in the difference between small rural communities where they have volunteer firefighters and larger, more complex, populous communities where there are designated firefighters, designated facilities, designated resources, and budgets and line items and all of that. And it's not the case that the volunteer firefighters are not good at what they do, but the complexity and the breadth of what they would be tasked to do is such that it's just clearer and better for everyone to have specific people who are tasked with performing that function in the community, in the society. And so there's also specialized training that goes along with performing those functions, and when people are trained and are better capable and prepared and funded and have resources to do the function, then they tend to do it better than people who are doing it as they can or as they will or as necessary, even though they might not have any training at all. And also what we get too is within larger, more complex societies, there are institutional structures that can then so they're sort of self-reproducing. They bring into their fold people who can learn the skills and develop the specialization and undertake those specialized tasks much better than allowing it to be sort of haphazard or whoever is available. All right, so what do we get when we take a role morality approach? Well, it allows us to account for an interesting phenomenon. It allows us to account for why we permit differential treatment. That is, some people can be treated differently from others according to their relation to the occupant of a social role. We recognize that some people are clients of others, and so they are treated differently. We recognize that some children are children of particular parents, and so we accept and perhaps require that parents treat their children in ways that they wouldn't treat other people's children. And we in society recognize that differential treatment and value that differential treatment. Role morality also allows us to see why it is that we permit differential expectations. That is, that we can expect more from those who occupy certain roles than we can justify expecting of everyone. We don't ordinarily have the expectation that anyone run into a burning building to rescue the people trapped inside. However, we do have that expectation of firefighters. Why don't we have that expectation of just an ordinary person on the street? Well, because that ordinary person on the street might well put themselves in harm's way or make the situation worse, and doesn't have the training, and in absence of the training, the confidence to know what it is that they should be doing if they enter a burning building. And so we don't have that expectation. Now, people do act in ways that are what we would call heroic. That is to say, they act above and beyond any reasonable expectation we could have of them when they do rush in and help someone in danger, or when they do take care of a problem or a challenge that a child is facing, even though they have no relationship to the child. So these are people who we would deem to be exceeding expectations. But in society, we do expect more from those who are professionals and public servants, and from those who are people whom other people are in the care of. We expect more from teachers than we do from regular people. We expect more from parents than we do of just someone who happens to be around children. We expect more from police, from our public servants, from our politicians, from lawyers, from doctors than we do of regular people. And so role morality allows us to make sense of that. And it also helps us to make sense why we allow the specialization of ordinary moral constraints. And so when we have specializations of roles, even if we take the view that role morality isn't necessarily specifying special or different duties and obligations, we can make sense of why it is that we would expect more or expect a slight variation and specialization on those duties as they attach to those roles. So what are the ethically relevant features of roles then? Well, first of all, our expectations. Roles are occupied by individuals who are expected to act in certain ways to satisfy the purpose of that role, and so our expectations may be explicit or implicit in the structure of society. For that expectation to be explicit, then the structure of society would make obvious and dictate, and likely have the attached requirement that that role be voluntary. And so the expectations would be explicitly articulated. We expect you to serve and protect, we say to our police officers and to our fellow members of society who wish to become police officers. We expect you explicitly to be able to build bridges that don't fall down, we say to our civil engineers and to those members of our community who want to become civil engineers. However, we may have expectations that are implicit within the structure of society, and here it might be the case, as I was mentioning with grandparents, there's an implicit expectation that grandparents will be engaged in the lives of their grandchildren. But it's not like grandparents get a roadmap or special training, or they're given a package that explicitly indicates the expectations that we have of them when they become grandparents. And usually implicit expectations are attached to roles that are generally non-voluntary roles, the roles that we sort of accidentally find ourselves in. And of course, we also want to be attentive to deviations from the expectations, and deviations from those expectations then would warrant disapproval. And so under role morality, we would expect to see that when an individual deviates from the expectations, the social expectations attached to that role, that they would then receive social disapproval, if not more so. Promises are another relevant feature of roles. So by adopting the role, one assures others that one will act according to the requirements of that role. And then all of us others then form the expectations that you or the individual will comply with what they've just adopted. This is distinct from a contract. Now, a contract, like an employment contract, stipulates what the employee is required to do and what the employer are required to do, and so forth. But in social roles, it's not quite so explicit. It's more of a promise. If I undertake to become a parent, then I'm sort of promising my fellow members of my community that I'll do a good job raising this child, and especially bringing them into the community as a member that's worth having, that contributes to the good of the whole, and so forth. Now, it can be an explicit promise, and that again usually attaches to voluntarily assumed roles. And here it would be the case that that when one becomes a civil engineer, one is explicitly promising and will have the expectation that they understand that's what they're doing when they become a civil engineer. When they become licensed, it's like them saying, I promise to do what I'm supposed to be doing as a civil engineer, and you, society and community, will be able to reap the benefit of that. And then we have also implicit promises, and these attach again to the more accidentally assumed, non-voluntarily assumed role that one is merely filling because one happens to be in the place or in a particular relationship already established. And so voluntariness then is the third ethically relevant feature of social roles. If one voluntarily adopted a role, then of course there's a greater expectation of compliance with the requirements of that role when compared with someone who involuntarily adopted a role. And so we would have lesser expectations of compliance with the requirements of the role, and perhaps be more forgiving if they don't meet the highest standards of the role, but there would still be, of course, the expectation that those requirements will be met. So the social value of role morality. What does role morality do for us? Well, it gives us predictability of actions and the satisfaction of socially important functions. So it lets us identify who is responsible for what and what is it that they should be doing in a much more predictable way. It also allows us transparency of actions and of their justification. So both the role holder, the occupant, the participant in that role, and the broader public can be sure that their expectations are appropriate and attached to the right people. Right? So if for a teacher, it becomes clear what it is the teacher should be doing, and a teacher can't sort of hide behind the claim that they didn't know they were supposed to be doing that, or they didn't know that they shouldn't be doing this. There's a transparency of the required actions and their justification, both to the role holder and to the broader public. So role morality also mitigates vulnerability in others. So here I'm especially thinking of those with socially sanctioned monopolies of power. And these tend to be professions, and we'll see a little bit more of this later in the next lecture, but we've also seen some of this before in our discussion of professions, that there's a sense in which professions have monopolies of knowledge and monopolies of authority over certain domains of social activity and engagement. And so what role morality allows us to do is to attach very specific obligations and requirements to those professions or to those roles, such that the vulnerability the rest of us have with regard to that monopoly of power, knowledge, and activity and agency is mitigated. It also allows the satisfaction of conditions of dependency on others, so those designated, trained, and authorized occupants or participants in the role have to meet the social needs of that role. The reason why we have teachers is we require much more specialized education than parents can be expected to provide. The reason why we have police is to ensure the security and public safety needs that we have that are too complex and too intricate and too frequent to leave to individuals to protect themselves and so forth. There's also the enhancement, or we have an enhanced understanding of individual autonomy for those who are attempting to access or get some service provided for them. So when they know what who's responsible for doing what and what it is that those individuals should be doing, then people who are seeking out that kind of service or that kind of have a need that that particular role can satisfy will have a greater autonomy in determining who and what to trust, how far, and in what regards. And so that enriches all of our choice, interpretation, and assessment of the adequacy of those individuals and that role. And it also allows for efficiency through the specialization of functions. I think I've talked about that quite a bit, so let's move on. All right, the relation of roles to ethics. So the social role, it's important to understand that social roles might lead to conflict with ordinary morality, and I've given us some examples of how that might work, which requires role holders or participants to act in ways otherwise immoral. And so here we might envision a firefighter breaking into a building in the course of her duty to put out a fire, while ordinarily we expect each other not to break into buildings, especially when they're not our own. We even wonder about somebody breaking into their own building or house. But generally we have the expectation of privacy, but in the course of performing certain functions, professionals and role holders might actually have to undertake to do certain things that we would otherwise think immoral. And now the additional side to that is that social roles and the obligations that attach to them might require the occupants of that role, the participants in that role, the role holders, to act in ways otherwise not morally required. So I gave the example previously about someone, we don't have the expectation that someone just walking along the street would run into a burning building to save the occupants or the people who can't get out. That we would call supererogatory or heroic. But we do expect that of a trained firefighter. Normally, we don't have that expectation. Normally, we don't have the obligation or the duty to rescue that puts us in harm's way to such an extent. But when certain people occupy specific roles whose purpose is to achieve that and or provide that service or that safety or that aid, then we do have the expectation that the occupants of that role undertake to provide that aid or perform that service or what have you. All right, social roles may necessitate a variation of ordinary morality, trust, privacy, security, those kinds of things, where we have the same values and principles that we ordinarily expect of others, but we have a higher expectation of compliance. So we expect firefighters to break into a building in order to get in and put out the fire, but we don't expect them, that is, we expect them not to violate ordinary moral requirements not to take things that don't belong to them. So for instance, if they see a nice diamond ring on the dresser, not to put that in their pocket while they're fighting the fire in someone's house. So the expectation that we still comply with ordinary moral requirements is there, but held to a higher standard. And that higher standard, of course, attaches to the vulnerability of individuals who are being helped in that particular way. So the homeowner whose home is on fire but who left some valuables on the dresser is more vulnerable than he or she would be ordinarily to the individuals fighting their fire, but because they're in the space, in the vicinity, and fighting the fire, there's a higher expectation of compliance with those ordinary moral requirements of privacy and respect and non-theft and so forth. And so the rule may also be understood as a sui generis source of ethical obligation. Sui generis is a Greek term for meaning of itself, so generated from itself. So the social rule of itself generates ethical obligations. What's the relation of role morality to professions and public service? Well, one chooses to enter a particular profession or to become a member of the public service. So one's role-related obligations are therefore voluntarily assumed. And those obligations would then be derived from the purpose, the mission, the function of the profession or the office or branch of service. Now, the obligations would be toward the public or the community broadly, on the one hand, which the role serves, and to the particular clients, for example, patients, one serves in specific within that profession or within that particular public service. Obligations are also owed toward the institution of the public service within which falls within a particular institution or other, and to the professional organization. And both the institution and the professional organization are owed obligations by professionals and public servants, in large part because they define and sustain the role and make that profession or that public service possible. And one also owes duties toward one's fellow officers, public servants, and professionals, even if they are of a different profession or a different public service. Recall from earlier our discussion of how professions and public services are interrelated and interconnected, and professionals from one profession often have dealings with professionals from another profession, and so we owe each of those obligations. Now, it's also the case that those obligations and expectations may compete with or conflict with one's ordinary moral obligations, or with one's other social role obligations. So if one is both a teacher and a parent, or a doctor and a spouse, or a police officer and a father. And so they might conflict if one has to arrest one's own child, or in the course of serving in the emergency room, the doctor's spouse comes in need of care. So there are times when our obligations may conflict. Finally, let's just talk about how we assess role morality. So when we're trying to figure out what the particular role requires, or whether the role is adequate, or what sort of ethical obligations attached to that role, we ask a series of questions. And what we do is we ask first, what are the role-defined obligations? And once we have those listed, then we ask the next question. Does satisfying these obligations advance the accomplishment of the function or purpose of the role? If yes, then we don't have to revise the ethical requirements of that role. But if no, then we can ask a series of related questions. Do any of the obligations conflict with the function or purpose of the role? Do any of the obligations conflict with other obligations, such that this or related roles are impeded? Are any obligations missing? And finally, is this role no longer socially necessary or valuable? And as we answer those questions, then we go back and we examine what the role is and what its purpose is. And finally, we can ask whether the purpose or the function of that role has significantly changed. And if it has, then we go back to question 1 and we start again. And if it hasn't, then we can feel confident that the role and the ethical requirements attached to it are still functioning satisfactorily. All right, wrapping up. Social roles are socially valuable, and there are elements of them that are ethically relevant. Role morality is an approach which allows us to make sense of our practice of holding professionals and public servants accountable in ways we do not do of everyone else. Our practice of maintaining high expectations of ethical conduct from everyone while allowing specialization of the multiple responsibilities of living in a complex society, and of understanding ourselves in relation to different people at different times and the responsibilities we have to each of them. Role morality also accounts for why it is that professionals and public servants should have different expectations placed upon them, for they're voluntarily adopting these roles, and so we should expect them to meet the standards in to a higher degree. And as social roles are negotiated, so are the relevant ethical requirements. All right, now here are some questions to think about, and if you can answer these questions and you feel confident, then you're ready to move on to the next lecture. Thank you very much.